Hey, everyone. I'm Jeff Diamond. I think I know most of you personally, and the ones I don't, hello. It's really good to see you. What started as just a diversion for me during COVID as a way for me to slow down my drinking, create a drink, post it onto a group, and then along with the recipe has turned into something where we've got about 200 members, and it looks like about maybe 20 to 30 active weekly participants. And I think that's really great. And I've been learning a ton from this group, and I want to thank you all for participating. Jake, if you don't know him, is one of the brightest guys on the planet and knows more about the stuff that he sells. Knows more about the stuff that he sells than I think most of us do. And whenever he comes in to the shop, which isn't happening right now, I walk away with my mind spinning with all of the stuff that he's taught me. And so when the opportunity came to have Jake present to this group, I jumped on it. And if this works well for all of us, this is the first of several seminars that Jake is going to be hosting. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jake Parrott. Here we go, Jake.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to thing one. So let me start. I'm going to share my screen here. As soon as I get back to Zoom, this is great TV, isn't it? There we go. Can folks see that? Good. All right. So yeah, thank you, Jeff, for the opportunity to do this. Thank you to the group for wanting to do this. Please use the chat box for questions, and Jeff will be monitoring that. So through this time. Tonight we're going to go through a fair amount of things that aren't just about Vermouth to lay the groundwork for maybe some future sessions. But then when we get down to tasting, we'll focus on Vermouth, its history, its traditional styles, and all the wonderful things that you can do with it. So, but before that, we'll get to some of the history.
What are you doing?
How did we get here? What these things are made of. And then in particular, sort of the historical context in which Vermouth emerges in the modern scene, and in some cases, the subcategories of Vermouth and how they arise and why they taste the way they taste. We'll taste a few things. Please feel free to start drinking. Do not wait for the tasting to start drinking. And then I think for each of these seminars, we're going to do something in the mixology world. And I think the easiest thing to talk about in the context of this tasting is talking about the Manhattan and its related drinks and sort of how to think about selecting a Vermouth or other aromatized wine to pair with your whatever whiskey you're playing around with. Your questions are really important. Certainly discussion will be really important. And then when we stop recording, we can certainly have some social time at the end as well. The recording will be available. It'll be on the Facebook group, etc. And I might even go through it on YouTube at some point. All right. First things first, aromatized wines are wines. Please, please, please keep these in the fridge. How long they last after opening, follow your nose is the easiest guidance there. But the way if you want to look at it a little more systematically, you want to think about the sweetness level. The sweeter an aromatized wine is, the thicker the liquid is when it's cold, which means the less the sort of fresh, high aromatics will volatilize out of the liquid and then fly away when you open up the cap. So something like the Cocchi Vermouth di Torino will last longer in the fridge than something like Dolin Dry, simply because it's sweeter. General rule of thumb, though, after a couple of 3 weeks, you want to make sure that you're smelling and checking and tasting before you go too deep into something. they don't die right away necessarily, but they do lose that sort of essence of the wine and brightness and pertinence that you really want, whether you're mixing these or pairing them with food or drinking them by themselves. So really, really important. The second thing that's really important and goes to the same point of aromatized wines or wine is aromatized wines are as old as wine. This is not just a new modern thing that hip people thought up so that they could, charge $14 for cocktails before tax and tip. Basically, in ancient times, there were three kinds of wine. There was nouveau wine, make it, drink it. There was the highly prized sorts of wines that would have been long aged in amphora or later in barrel, sort of the precursor of the what we think of as Catalan Rancio wines these days, that were prized possessions of a household. But the vast majority of what got drunk that was fermented from fruit would have had herbs added to it, and those herbs would have been whatever was around. That said, bitterness has been thought of as being potentially helpful to one's stomach or for other reasons, as long as people have been taking stuff out of the ground and putting it in their mouth. So, the what's on the screen here is a very famous sort of one of the earliest fermentable beverages that were discovered in Jiahu in the Yellow River Valley in China. The story that's on here is actually one that has been recreated in the beer world. The folks at Dogfish Head made a beer called Chateau Jiahu that was a mimic of what they found in the residue of these amphora back in the day. Go forward another 3,000 years into Egypt, and now we start getting to things that we recognize as bitter, things like tree resins, mint, coriander. Wormwood would have already been known at this time, although it was better known in Europe. But again, wines with other things in them, and were very, very normal. You get to ancient Greece. Yes.
Was the wines with other things in them like pine tar, was that used as a preservative?
I'm not sure they really knew. I mean, they didn't have a reference to think of preservation like we do. I think it just was to make it taste good. There wasn't really any sense of preservation until sulfur or fortification, both of which sort of emerged in the 1800s. So it's they knew this alcohol, this fermented stuff made them feel good, and if they added other herbs to it, they knew it was safer than the water. And if they added other stuff to it, it might taste better. It starts to become more, the particular things you might bitter with start to become more recognized in ancient Greek times. And there's a variety of different things that we know from the world of ancient Greece, including the use of flowers, the use of honey, the use of citrus. Wormwood was known in ancient Greece. And if you think about it, right, wine, honey, citrus, and wormwood makes a pretty good vermouth. Of course, they didn't have the word vermouth at the time, but that would have been a very happy vermouth. In fact, probably better than what a lot of people who try to make their own vermouth today come up with. But the point is that as soon as people fermented grapes, they put herbs in them. And those wines were probably the most common wines consumed. As you fast forward into the 1600s and the 1700s, obviously much more of an apothecary study of bitter herbs. We'll talk more about that in a little while. But a lot of different bitter botanicals were known for potentially positive effects that I'm not allowed by law to talk about. I realize it sounds like I'm dancing around here, but because I sell beverage alcohol, I'm not allowed to get anywhere close to health claims about these things. Don't worry, Google is your friend, and there's plenty of herbalist websites out there. And once this became a business, that the business of delivering these herbs through drink, starting getting into the 1700s, wine was a lot less expensive than distilled alcohol. Really, distilled alcohol doesn't become cheap until after World War I, when industrial alcohol production for war making became ended, and that alcohol was unavailable for making infused spirits. But wine was everywhere and wasn't getting any better after it was made. And so the use of wine to deliver these herbs was very, very common. And what built up over time, starting in the late 1700s, were regionalized styles. And this, again, is nothing new. You might say that the idea of aromatizing wine in the modern sense was created by the ancient Greeks and then stolen by the Romans, much like the Romans stole everything else. Well, the Romans made it a hipster thing. Every house had their own recipe for things. And so it's unsurprising later on that again, you see this regionalization of styles and flavor profiles. And we'll talk about that because Vermouth is probably the easiest to see overall styles. When we talk about Quinquina, we'll talk about it in a little more specific fashion. And then to the extent that any of this business was sustained, it was the use in cocktails that really sustained it, starting in about 1890, and then taking through kind of the first golden age of cocktails. Sustained some producers. Unfortunately, American Prohibition was the death knell for a lot of small producers. All right, so that's a little bit of historical background. Next, I want to take you through a little bit more book learning on what is in these things. And this is material taken from the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, about as good a authority on all this stuff as you might imagine. And the easiest way to break down what's in an aromatized wine is 5 components. The first that I put on here is, and I put it on here first, not because it's the most important, but just because this is kind of the least to talk about, is the fortifying spirit. These are fortified wines. Now, while early fortifying spirit would have been not neutral, would have had flavor, in the modern day, virtually every aromatized wine you see on the market is going to be fortified with neutral alcohol. There's a variety of reasons. One is cost, one is consistency, and one is because you're really trying to express the wine and the plants much more than trying to get a sort of funky taste of spirit in there. The others, though, we'll talk about in a little more depth. Grapes. So by European and American law, if you're going to call something an aromatized wine, and Vermouth is one category of aromatized wine, then it's got to be at least 75% grapes. But those grapes can be fully fermented, partially fermented, or completely unfermented. There's no distinction made in law. And because it's very hard to check, right? It's you don't know how much grapes have been fermented because in theory they're fermenting is while they're still on the vine.
Hey Jake, we have a question.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between fortified and aromatized?
So they're completely different. Fortified wines are just wines that have had had alcohol added to them to either stop fermentation or just to raise the amount of alcohol. Aromatized wines have herbs and other flavorings added to them. So generally, what you see, virtually all aromatized wines in the modern day are also fortified. That fortifying spirit, by the way, is also generally what the herbs are infused in. And you do that for a couple of reasons. Speed, they infuse faster. Consistency, they infuse in a much more predictable way than they do in wine. And third is you don't want to get oxygen into the wine. Today in the modern era, we have sulfur. We can keep a wine fresh. And if you're agitating a wine with botanicals, there's a chance that oxygen will get into the system. So using the alcohol to extract the herbs makes for a lower cost of production, better quality and consistency, and better expression of the wine and the herbs. Now, there's an important point here about the grapes. If you taste Dolin Dry and you taste Cocchi Vermouth di Torino, you'll notice that Dolin Dry, like, it has a texture and character of wine, but not something really, really distinctive. Whereas Cocchi Vermouth di Torino, which is Moscato based, you get a ton of that Moscato.
Jake, you just went mute, at least on my screen. Can you fix your sound?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right.
Back.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, each producer can decide whether or not the grapes are a big part of the flavor of the finished aromatized wine. That's something that's generally breaks down in regionalized styles in traditional modern vermouth. But in the world of quinquina, which we'll talk about the next session, each producer is using their grapes or not using the flavor of their grapes to make a very specific regional expression. Sugar. This is where we make Mary Poppins happy. Aromatized wines, bitter aromatized wines are sweetened, or they have sugar. That sugar isn't necessarily residual, although certainly grapes can be a source of the sugar, either from mistel, completely unfermented juice hit with alcohol right away, or partially fermented fortified wine. There are two ways to add sugar. You can add pale sugar, which just adds sweetness, or you can add caramelized sugar. And caramelized sugar adds a lot of things. It adds color, it adds sweetness, it adds flavor, it adds bitterness, it can add texture. But you got to be careful because these are things that people are drinking cold. And if you think about eating a Milky Way bar right out of the refrigerator, if you put too much caramel in something, it's going to deaden how you taste other things. So that's a stylistic choice that different producers make. Some people like the bitterness of caramel, and so we'll use more as a very important part of the flavor impact. Our view at House Alpens is we like our things to have a little bit less of that caramel characteristic. Now, the amount of sugar is something that, of course, is each producer's choice. But what we have found over the years is that, in general, things from Italy tend to be sweeter. Now, I get quite cynical about that. I sort of think that Italians just like very sweet things. And that's largely true. If you think about one of the really classic ways that Italians drink Amaro, it's next to espressos, which by and large aren't that good. And so you need all that extra richness to go with them. But that's a pretty partial explanation of things. All right. This is really the key slide when you talk about categories of aromatized wine, the defining bitter note. These things were sold. These things were positioned in the market as deliverers of these herbs. Yes, the wine was important. Yes, the style of the producer was important. But people initially bought these things. Oh, I'm buying vermouth so I can have wormwood because I want the effects of wormwood. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm buying Americano because I want the effects of gentian, which is both a flower and a root that are quite bitter and earthy. And then probably the most interesting phenomenon of modern aromatized wine was the phenomenon of quinquina or quinine bittered wine. People wanted quinine. You might think of quinine in the late 19th and early 20th century like CBD today, something that had this sort of very broad appeal for a lot of different uses. So these things are codified in European law. They are not codified in American law, which is a real tension. A producer can make an aromatized wine in America, put no wormwood in it at all, and still label it as vermouth and sell it in America. They can't do that in Europe, and they can't sell their American not vermouth in Europe. It's very important to us as House Alpens to respect these categories because they come from Europe, and also because I want a vermouth to taste and mix as if it has the characteristics of wormwood. Something we'll talk about in the next session when we talk about the mixology of gin. The fifth component, by the way, are the other botanicals that each producer uses to make their own styles. In the world of vermouth, those botanicals again kind of break down under along regional lines. So we'll talk about that when we talk about categories of vermouth. A little bit about wormwood. The primary wormwood, while any member of the Artemisia family can be used in vermouth, Artemisia absinthium is definitely the big winner. And the etymology is here, and immediately it comes off, unenjoyable. That's what absinthium means. People knew they were drinking this, at least in part, because they had to, not just because they wanted to. And they knew right away, they knew very early that balancing it with sugar, and of course, in the ancient world, honey was very important. Now, moving forward, those of you who may have studied the Book of Revelation, this is one of the more violent references to wormwood in culture. But wormwood is the name of a star that makes 1/3 of the waters of earth bitter in the Book of Revelation. You can read into that how much you want. I can't sit here and tell you I am a scholar of the Book of Revelation. If you do have some time and you want to go back really down in the catacombs, the Complete Herbal or the English Physician, it's not hard to find a copy of this online or from old books. This guy was a fanatic for wormwood and just rambled on and on about it, Nicholas Culpeper, and really, this is the first compendium of herbalism in modern English. A lot of the early studies of wormwood a lot of the early modern studies of wormwood were German. And in fact, the idea of putting wormwood in wine and referring to that as Vermouth starts in German writings in the 1500s. But this guy talks about it 148 times in a whole herbal book. And there's some crazy stuff here. And it ends with this paragraph here, which I won't read, but if you look up the word paroxysm in the dictionary, you might as well read this thing. But suffice it to say that the societal demand for these herbs was the thing that caused these categories to come forward. And the fact that they were made with wine is great for us because they taste good that way, but also is something of a coincidence. So when are we talking about? We've covered a lot of this already, but just to frame it, and the vermouth business emerges in the late 1700s. Giuseppe Carpano, Dolin, and the Chambéry style of vermouth comes along in 1821. But the business really explodes in the late 1800s and then into the early 20th century, into the Belle Epoque and on. At that point in time, you post 1848 Europe, you have railroads, the ability to get product across France and Italy. You have the concentration of wealth in cities. You have the emergence of an upper middle class and a nouveau riche. You have popular media and marketing and branding. And so this sort of base desire for wormwood or gentian or quinine becomes something that you can sell at. And so that's why you see all this wonderful artwork from that era, and whether it's the Comoz label or the iconic posters for Martini or Cinzano, those really come out of that essentially boom in leisure society. The spritz also comes from this era, long before Aperol was the gleam in the Barbieri family's eyes. The spritz was a leisure drink. It was a drink that was a more liquid than a very quick drink, something that you could sit at a cafe and drink at for a while. It was a reflection of a leisure class. More on that perhaps in a future session. So now we'll get to regionalized styles, and this is where we'll talk a little bit more about how they varied. The two regionalized styles that are protected by European Union geographic indications are Chambéry in France and Torino in Italy. Now, take out the France and Italy for a moment, because when these two categories first emerged, Chambéry and Torino were part of the same political unit. You notice they're not that far from each other. And that political unit wasn't called France or Italy. It was called the Kingdom of Sardinia. And so, you see cocktail books, of course, later in the 19th century and early in the 20th century, talk about French vermouth and Italian vermouth. They're making a distinction that's important stylistically, but wasn't really there when these things started to emerge. The Chambéry style was meant to mimic the sort of fragrant and delicate white wines of the region. And so the wine base itself was really relatively gentle. And the other flavorings were mostly mountain flowers and herbs, things that had a delicacy on the palate, were pretty, didn't create too much of a forceful intensity. Of course, Chambéry vermouth all vermouth started as sweet, pale or dark, but there was always a delicacy to Chambéry vermouth. Torino vermouth, Torino is right in the heart of Piemonte. And so Torino vermouth was meant to mimic the big red wines of the region. So there was much more intensity and spice characteristic to the vermouth, less flowers and herbs, more spice, citrus, and bitter. And that, you might say it's a chicken and egg thing. Did the taste for extra sweetness in Italy grow up because of things like Vermouth di Torino, the early examples of Vermouth di Torino, or the other way around? I can't say for sure. But if you think about that fifth element of the structure of aromatized wines, the other botanicals, there's that real bifurcation here in Chambéry, floral and herbal, Torino, bitter, spicy, citric. Other styles also emerge later on in the 19th and early 20th century in Marseille, which was an area that was highly commercially advantaged after Prohibition because it was a port. A somewhat rancio style of vermouth that would sit in barrels out in the sun for a bit emerged. There's only one example of that remaining, which is Noyer Prat, which is a vermouth brand owned by Bacardi. And then in Reus in Catalonia, just south and east of, or just down the coast, I guess not east, but south down the coast from Barcelona and toward the coast from Tarragona, or away from the coast from Tarragona, a style of vermouth making in Reus emerged first as a stopgap for during phylloxera, much like Rioja replaced Bordeaux and Burgundy during phylloxera. But people got a taste for the stuff. But the Reus style of vermouth is quite friendly, gently sweet, usually good acidity, a little bit of spice and citrus, but mostly just something you can really guzzle. And in fact, in Barcelona today, it's very typical to take a big glass of vermouth on ice before lunch. Isn't that nice? Who made these things? Herbalists for sure. Certainly Dolin was an herbalist. Cocchi was both a winery and a distiller. And remember, a lot of producers back in the late 19th century were both wineries and distillers. Think of the Christian brothers in California. Certainly both made wine and made brandy. Sadly, very few of those old producers remain. The taste for the stuff was lost in Europe, but also in America. Certainly American Prohibition really did it for a lot of smaller producers. It just became very hard to get it to the US. Sadly, the sort of romance of Americans being the only people who don't drink vermouth by itself, as much as that sounds like an easy pat way to explain things, it's just not the case, unfortunately. In fact, through shops like Jeff's and I hope in small part through companies like ours, we've been reviving all the different ways to drink aromatized wines and other beautiful bittersweet things. But yeah. All right. I think before we get too much into the tasting, are there other questions you guys want to chime in on real quick?
I've seen
Jeff?
I see nothing on the chat.
Okay.
So if anybody wants to pipe in, just if you have a question, just to go to chat and type it in, and I'll relate it to Jake. All right.
Cool. All right. So you have those of you who do have the bottles. Thank you so much for picking those up. And this is where we'll get into to start tasting. We'll start with Dolin. Dolin, founded in 1821, so this is their 200th anniversary year. Is a yes, David, that's fine. Very good. Dolin were the first producer of vermouth in Chambéry, and sadly, they are also pretty much the last producer of vermouth in Chambéry. The bifurcation between Chambéry and Marseille after American Prohibition really advantaged Marseille in terms of being closer to port. That said, Dolin has had commercial success in America in the past, long before when we started working with them in 2008. So the little tin sign down at the bottom is not something we just made up. That's a picture from the Dolin office. But this is a really good example of taking the Chambéry style, which started as a sweet style, and then taking it to the drier taste that emerged in the early 20th century once dry gin started to become a thing. So Dolin Dry, now I think recognized by a lot of folks as kind of a benchmark for martinis, especially martinis made with classic true English gins that are juniper forward. Tasting this by itself, I would say taste this by itself and maybe put a little lemon peel on it. Peel off a bit of lemon peel and express the oils on it. That's my favorite way to drink it, just on ice, maybe with a little herbed goat cheese or some Castelvetrano olives, or maybe even a little bit of smoked fish. For me, and you know, this group being on a cocktail website or cocktail Facebook group, most of you have played around with Dolin Dry before and played around with good aromatized wines in general before. And so I think some of the purpose of this may be to help y'all with getting your friends excited about vermouth and not turning their noses up at it. And I think with that in mind, I would share with you that still one of my favorite things to do is to pour someone a fresh taste of Dolin Dry when they've never had vermouth in their life, or they even protest that they don't like vermouth, even though they've never had good fresh vermouth by itself in their life. And I hope when you taste this, you get, even if you're tasting it for the 50th time, that you get that same sensation. This plays well in a lot of things. It isn't the most intense in flavor, but because of that, you can use a fair amount of it in a cocktail, which can help spread out other flavors in a drink. So if you think about some of the whiskey and dry vermouth drinks, like the Brooklyn or the Old Pal, this is something that really serves as a buffer in those drinks. It creates this undertone of wine, this undertone of acidity, but also just that little bit of herbality that frames everything. And then in the martini, it's the kind of thing that even a little bit will add the texture that you want. That said, I do enjoy 50-50 martinis, half gin, half vermouth. One point of personal taste in terms of the martini, my view is when you make martinis with Dolin Dry, you learn very quickly that a martini is a drink with orange bitters in it. I know that people go all over the place on martini builds, but for me, orange bitters do a great job of kind of getting that last little ribbon, tying everything together in a dry martini made with a traditional gin and Dolin Dry.
I have a question. How did the martini go from being 50-50 or to the dry martini that James Bond made so famous of, whispering the name vermouth as you pour the gin into the glass? Any ideas about how that happened?
I mean, I think I don't have chapter and verse there. I think a lot of it was good vermouth went away from the market. that and people lost over the course of a generation, post-prohibition, lost the understanding of what it meant for vermouth to be fresh. And then also, depression and war sometimes leads people to want very, very strong drinks. And then you get into the 50s and the rise of vodka. Vodka is considered new and from elsewhere and hip and cool, and vodka and vermouth doesn't really work all that well. Vodka and dry vermouth, at least. So by then you get to the 60s and 70s, and the vermouth producers, the producers who make good vermouth have mostly gone, very good vermouth have mostly gone away. The producers who are bringing vermouth to the market are mainly selling it to people who are cooking with it, and it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, I mean, even today, we a lot of people buy Dolin Dry to cook with it, and it is very good to cook with. No less an authority than Julia Child would tell you that you should always cook with dry vermouth instead of dry white wine, because it's a little more intense, has that little bit of sugar, and has a little more, because of the extra alcohol, will volatilize flavors more, so you smell it more in your finished dish. All right. Next, we'll get to kind of the style of vermouth that was the first style in Chambéry, and that's Blanc vermouth. Now, most folks think that sweet vermouth is only a dark colored thing. But like we talked about earlier, the thing that makes dark vermouths dark is caramelized sugar. And caramelized sugar, at least at first, was something that was a Torino thing. The vermouths of Chambéry started as sweet, but were not actively colored. Over time, that taste for delicacy in vermouth led to producers like Dolin and Comoz to filter their vermouth even more so they could get to a much lighter color. And thus was formed the idea of Vermouth Blanc. Because originally it was just sold as Vermouth de Chambéry. But Vermouth Blanc emerges from, and Dolin and Comoz would fight over it, over who had it first. But it became the signature style of Chambéry. And it became the signature style of Chambéry because of the family Comoz. Dolin, even though they were the first producer, and even though they did do some export, they never really got into this sort of hip and sort of style of modern vermouth marketing or aromatized wine marketing that emerged in the late 1800s. Comoz took Chambéry vermouth and took it around the world. And it was with the formula that's in your glass, which is on the dry side for a sweet vermouth. It's a little more overtly herbaceous. So we want to talk about the flavor of Wormwood. I think the flavor of Wormwood shows up very clearly here. If you think about that sort of intense, maybe even slightly earthy herbaceousness that you feel on the tip of your tongue, that's the flavor of Wormwood. And Comoz Blanc, to me, is a really good way. Tasting Comoz Blanc is a really good way to kind of isolate that characteristic of Wormwood, so you know how to pick it up when you taste other vermouths. There's also a pronounced, to me, a pronounced characteristic of stone fruit, which comes mainly from cherry bark, which is a classic bitter in brown Amari, but doesn't show up much in aromatized wine. Now,
I have a question from Rob Foreman, Walter Wall Carpeting. When was the Blanc created and promoted initially again?
So Blanc, with the name Blanc vermouth, emerges in 1881. But the sweet vermouths of Chambéry before that were still quite a bit paler than the sweet vermouths of Torino. So it's the name and the promotion. Again, once you get into the 1870s and 1880s, this becomes much more of a marketing-based activity and not just a local artisan activity. So there's a lot of blurred lines, much like there is in the world of whiskey. So Yeah, Joe, unfortunately we had to do this bottle shot before we had the product in, so we actually had to put water in it to do this bottle shot. So we have to do another bottle shot. That Joe is asking about the color of the Comoz. Yeah, the Comoz is not quite this clear. But Comoz's work around the world, if you look at it with the lens of hindsight, its most important work was in Cuba. And in fact, Comoz was the only vermouth sold in Cuba for more than a generation. And it was that generation that codified really the classic Cuban cocktails. Of course, many of those were sort of the Hemingway drinks, the Hemingway daiquiri and the Negroni, or the mojito and things like that. But the great aromatic cocktail of Cuba, the Presidente, white rum, what was in a lot of books as French vermouth, Curacao grenadine. Well, David Wondrich started doing some digging about 10, 15 years ago, and he realized that Comoz was the only vermouth that was there during that time, and Comoz only made Blanc vermouth. And so the Presidente had to be a Blanc vermouth cocktail, not a dry vermouth cocktail. Because most folks, when they see French vermouth in an old cocktail book, they assume dry vermouth. But that the Wondrich and other researchers, including Francois Monti, who's a great vermouth writer based in Madrid, were able to draw the lines and be like, no, the Presidente is a Blanc vermouth cocktail. And then when you mix the drink, it becomes so much clearer. You know, a Presidente made with dry vermouth is quite austere and doesn't really integrate the Curacao into it very, very well. Whereas you make it with a Blanc vermouth, you get that little bit of extra sugar and that little bit of extra kind of dark, robust mid palate that you get from the cherry bark and Comoz, especially. You get something that comes together very, very well. So I know there was a thread on the Presidente earlier this week, and that's the punchline, is that the Presidente is a Blanc vermouth drink. Jeff?
David from Texas asks, how would you compare the Dolin and Comoz Blancs?
Sure.
He says he's just now had the Comoz, but hasn't done a side-by-side. And since the Dolin Blanc wasn't part of our syllabus, what's your take?
Yeah. So Dolin Blanc, you might call it something that the style of Dolin Blanc is a little bit more how Blanc vermouth would have been sold right in Chambéry back in the day, a little bit less bitter and a little bit of characteristic of vanilla. You know, vanilla is it's a tricky thing in the cocktail world because it can sometimes mute other flavors. But Dolin Blanc by itself is very delicious, and it's part of that vanilla. That vanilla, a little bit of vanilla really does help there. But the main thing is Comoz is a little bit drier and a little more bitter. Because it's a little bit drier, it works well. It works well in a lot of cocktails that have multiple sweeteners. The Presidente being an example, but because it's lower in vanilla, I find Comoz works very well in whiskey cocktails as well, because the whiskey is bringing the vanilla, and you don't need two sources of vanilla in a drink. So I'll often take Comoz and a bourbon or rye, and then a little bit of a very rich Amaro, just to give it a little bit of a varnish, if you will, and that you can take that in a lot of directions for cocktails. That said, for me, Blanc vermouth is, to me, a good Blanc vermouth with just almost any cheese works so well. And if you're having a diverse cheese plate, I think Blanc vermouth is really the answer. All right. Dolin Rouge. So I put Dolin Rouge in the tasting to kind of set up the conversation about the Manhattan in a little while. Dolin Rouge is an important historic Dolin product, but it is unabashedly to create a sort of Chambéry style of what is a Chambéry take on a Torino style. It's still a Chambéry vermouth. It's still herbaceous. It's still less sweet. But the idea of putting caramelized sugar into a Chambéry vermouth was a little bit weird. But as drinks like the Manhattan started to emerge, and the Negroni was a very important business decision for Dolin back in the early 20th century. So That said, Dolin Rouge, to me, I love talking about Dolin Rouge, and I love tasting Dolin Rouge with folks because it is so delicate, but it works so well with so many whiskeys, in my opinion. But I would say in general, it works well because it doesn't bring so much sugar to the party. And whiskeys, especially the sort of young bourbons and ryes that we tend to mix cocktails with today, tend to have an overt richness and almost sugary character. But Dolin Rouge, unabashedly a red vermouth, but unabashedly a Chambéry vermouth. So it's a nice kind of crisscross in styles. A couple of questions in the chat here since I finally figured out how to do it.
Oh, good. I was just about to jump in and tell you to look at the chat.
Go ahead, Jeff.
So David of Oakland asks about Wormwood. So has Wormwood been used in vermouth for a long time or only since absinthe has been re-allowed into this country? I'm just talking about in America.
Yeah, no. Wormwood was never banned in vermouth. The banning of absinthe in America was a protectionist activity to protect the Sazerac company, which made a pastis-like thing called Herb Saint in New Orleans. And it was pure protectionism. Much like the banning of weed in America was essentially protectionism for American tobacco interests.
I'm shocked at this, really.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Rob asks, does Comoz produce other styles? No, they don't. Comoz now, that product is now made at Dolin. The Comoz family in the 1990s finally saw the writing on the wall for the vermouth trade and licensed it out to Dolin. And so we're very happy to preserve it because of the importance of Comoz in the history of cocktails. But it's now, as you might have figured from the similarity in bottle to the Dolin bottle, it is now made at Dolin. So, yeah. So I'm hoping you're able to taste all of these side by side, but certainly to have the Dolin Rouge and the Cocchi Vermouth de Torino side by side, so you can see how stark the difference is. So Torino or Piemonte in general was much more widely known as a wine producing region even back in the day, and so it stood to reason that Torino producers or Piemontese vermouth producers would want to really celebrate the wines of their region. They did that in a couple of ways. One, by making a very intense and tactile style of vermouth. They mimicked kind of the well-known red wines of the region, but also by using the very famous Moscato grapes of the region, they created a perfume to their vermouths. And Cocchi, the Cocchi Vermouth de Torino is very much a reflection of that classic style. Cocchi is a winery. They own vineyards in Monferrato, in Scarone, in the areas in Acqui for Bracchetto, in the Moscato d'Asti zone, and they use their own Moscato to make this vermouth, and it shows. It shows texturally, it shows on the nose, it shows a great kind of sweet orange character. But the beyond that, it's all classic. A lot of spices, a little more sugar, a little more kind of dark brooding intensity, and so this is one that, a little bit sweet, a little more bitter, a little more of everything. And so that's why we talk about pairing this with salami. Essentially, when you're pairing food and aromatized wine, you want to match the level of intensity, but especially the level of salt in the food to the level of bitter in the wine, and the level of bitter in the wine to the level of fat and protein in the food. And so more means salami and Cocchi Vermouth de Torino. And if you haven't tried it yet, I definitely recommend you try it. That said, certainly most folks will buy red vermouth to make a Manhattan or another whiskey cocktail. And so we'll definitely get into talking about that a little bit. The designation Vermouth de Torino is now much more broadly adhered to. There's about 80 producers of Vermouth de Torino now. However, the reason it's more broadly adhered to is because they relaxed the rules about the wine When they wanted to form a consortio and and have a group of vermouth producers, they relaxed the rules and said it doesn't have to be Moscato anymore. But Cocchi is still one of the very few producers. Their Vermouth di Torino is 100% Moscato, and in fact, the one of the head honchos at Cocchi is the head of the Vermouth di Torino Institute.
So Rob asked a question about the di Torino suffix. Does it have specific DOC requirements that other vermouths do not have?
Yes.
And
yeah,
they are?
It's a EU PGI, protected geographic indication. It's administered by the Istituto di Vermouth di Torino. And the main rule is there's certain rules about how high the alcohol has to be, but it's mainly that you use Piemontese wine as the base. Notice I didn't say Moscato. Again, that even though the classic was always Moscato, they relaxed it in order to get a bigger group. So Cocchi is one of the very few that uses all Moscato. And I think it's really important in the style of this vermouth to have that Moscato punching through and creating the perfume.
So it's always a red sweet vermouth, though. Yes.
No, there are you can make dry or Bianco, but there's very little tradition of dry vermouth on the Italian side of the Alps. Bianco vermouth, the most widely bought vermouth in the world is is Martini Bianco, Martini's Bianco vermouth. But that vermouth, if you taste it and if you taste Martini Bianco next to Dolin Blanc, you'll realize what Martini did. Dolin is 26 years older than Martini as a company. And Martini, when they made Bianco, they took a Chambéry style Blanc and made it Italian, which essentially means they made it sweeter. And they created an enormously successful product. And it is tasty, but it is definitely, I find that Italian Biancos tend to have too much sugar to handle the traditional botanical load that you have in Blanc vermouth.
And did you see Joe's question? I know we're going to be talking about Americanos in another seminar, but it is the same company.
Yeah, Cocchi make a full range of aromatized wines. In fact, at the end of this, I'm gonna show you our website, and so maybe I'll do it by showing you the Cocchi page.
Which is a really wonderful website, by the way. There's great recipes on there, and I'm assuming Jake had a lot to do with the content that's on there, but lots and lots and lots of really, really informative stuff.
Yeah,
and that's
real labor of love.
alpens.com.
Just alpens.com. But we'll have a quick tour around it at the end. And I promise you we're almost at the end. All right. How do you use these things? So again, you've just tasted through these, so they're fresh in your mind, but classic cocktail books will often call for dry or sweet vermouth, or French or Italian vermouth. Although when we talked about Comoz, we talked
or Italian or French.
Right. We talked about Comoz. We talked about how problematic that is. For drinks that call for dry vermouth, the Chambéry style is the cleanest, and I think it's the one that fits in with the other components in a drink really, really well. Torino is the traditional style of sweet vermouth, but it is on the sweet side, and you may not want a cocktail that's quite that sweet. It's Blanc vermouth that you get to have the real fun with. And I don't know if all of you have a good Blanco tequila with you, but if you do, I would ask you to taste Comoz and that good Blanco tequila 50-50. You do that, and I think that'll open a bunch of mixology doors to you. And it's another idea of the use of Blanc vermouth, but I think it really shows how versatile Blanc vermouth can be to add texture or intricacy to something that may be very strongly flavored, but isn't just whiskey or gin. It's Blanc vermouth where you can really go to town. Now, the most traditional way to drink Blanc vermouth in France is to just put a sliced strawberry and a splash of soda in it. And that's one of the most delicious things I've ever had. In fact, Dolin sell a strawberry flavored vermouth called Chambéry using the strawberry syrup that they make. We don't bring it in. There's a lot of reasons why, but it's also just tastes better when you make it yourself. There is an emerging modern category called Vermouth Amaro, essentially vermouth with additional bitter notes. Cocchi makes one called Dopo Teatro, which is really tasty, but definitely on the big and rich side. That's one where you think about for bigger spirits. And then, you know, I talked about this a little bit on the Facebook group. These things go great with food, and they go great with the foods that you would drink before a meal, that you would eat before a meal anyway. And these are the kinds of things you would drink before a meal. So it's it's a natural combination, but it's also one that keeps your palate clean for wine with dinner and keeps you hungry. The bitterness keeps you hungry so you can eat dinner.
This 50-50 Blanco tequila Comoz drink that you're talking about, does it have a name?
No.
Okay, I know what I'm going to post tomorrow night.
It's just a drink, man. I mean, it's, you know, oftentimes I will speak in terms of mixtures rather than cocktails, because a cocktail is something that's fully formed and has a name, etc. And you know, there are mixtures that you can make. We'll talk about this a lot when we talk about gin mixology, but there are mixtures you can make that are really fascinating, but may not be a complete drink. And this is one of them. I tend to put a couple of dashes of celery bitters in it, stealing a drink that was on an old mezcal brand's website.
Gotcha. There's a couple of suggestions so far for the drink name.
Don't call it the Jake.
It's going to be called the Jake, or it could be called the Locomos, which Rob has suggested.
Yeah, I mean, in our recipe, I'm sure there's some mixture in our recipe database that we call it something. But to me, that mixture is probably the most inspirational mixture of a spirit and an aromatized wine that I've ever had. Is a good Blanc vermouth and a good Blanco tequila together. So now we've had two red vermouths tonight that are very different in style, and even they are both kind of at the brighter end of the spectrum of red vermouth. There are certainly red vermouths that are higher in caramel than Cocchi Vermouth di Torino. There are certainly red vermouths that are higher in vanilla than Cocchi Vermouth di Torino, and there are definitely red vermouths that are sweeter than Cocchi Vermouth di Torino. But that said, I think the bifurcation, the difference between Dolin Rouge and Cocchi Vermouth di Torino is a good jumping off point for one of my favorite topics of conversation, which is the Manhattan. The Manhattan is a very tricky, for a drink that, you know, is an obvious icon cocktail. It's actually a little bit tricky. It's, you know, the whiskeys that you make those kind of cocktails with today are made with younger whiskeys raised in wood that has been in oak that has been less seasoned. So they have a lot more wood extractives and wood tannins. So when the whiskey itself gets cold, it's quite firm and quite intense on the palate. You have the proliferation of bitters that you can make a lot of different things with. But I really want to focus right now on just the idea of pairing whiskeys with vermouths. And I think the way I always think about it, and I talk about this in the terms of the Negroni as well, but there is no such thing as one Manhattan. If you're having a Manhattan before dinner, yeah, you want something that tastes like a Manhattan, but assuming you're having a nice dinner and maybe a nice wine that you bought from Jeff, you don't want to overwhelm your palate, and you want the sensation of the drink on your palate to still be wine-like, still have a lightness and brightness, a delicacy and an acidity. If you're having a Manhattan after dinner, maybe outside with a cigar, then you might want something very, very rich, something that lays on the tongue a little bit more, that gives you a little more texture, a little more, even a little more caramel in some contexts. And so those are two very different whiskeys, maybe two very different proportions, and maybe even an orange bitters versus Angostura bitters conversation. For me, I tend to focus on both the choice of vermouth and the amount of dilution in a Manhattan. So if I want a pre-dinner Manhattan, not only will I pick a gentle whiskey, maybe something like the 81 proof Wild Turkey Rye is something that I'm a big fan of. But I'll pick a gentle vermouth, Dolin Rouge, lower in sugar, lower in alcohol, or same alcohol, but lower in sugar, less spicy, less citric. Not just that though, I will dilute the drink more. You stir with ice, you get to a certain level of dilution, and that's great. After I strain the drink, I'll even add a little more water than that. And it might come across at first sip as something a little bit washed out. But as the drink warms up and as you start to chew on it, like you might chew on the wine that you're having with dinner, you'll realize that a lot of intricate flavors come out, and it really gets you in the mood to dine and drink good wine. Later on, go ahead.
Did you see David's question about the lighter style of sweet vermouth versus Cocchi versus a heavier, more aged style like Carpano or some of the Spanish extra aged red vermouths?
Yeah, Antica is not aged; it just has more vanilla in it. Antica formula is a vermouth a la vanilla. A vermouth with added vanilla. It was a traditional after dinner drink style in the late 19th and early 20th century. For me, it's not my favorite for Manhattans because the whiskey is bringing so much vanilla to the party. But if you've ever had Antica formula with chocolate mousse, it is a fantastic combination. The Spanish styles of vermouth, which also go all across the map, are really interesting. I tend to like the barrel aged ones by themselves because in Manhattans, I want the barrel character to come from the whiskey. But the unaged ones like the Timbal that we're about to bring back to market, those can be a lot of fun in Manhattans, and you can make them 50-50, equal parts whiskey and vermouth. Although I tend to make all of my Manhattans equal parts because I'm not very good at measuring.
Is Timbal the relaunching of the
Miro.
The Reus of the
of Miro. Yeah, nice. We had to change the name.
And that'll be coming out in a white and a red as well.
It'll be a
dry and a red.
Dry and red. Our first shipment will be 187s of dry and red and nice. 5-liter boxes of red. We'll eventually have 750s. The dry, and then remember the Miro dry is bone dry, 0 sugar.
Yeah. No more liters.
No more liters.
What is that you're talking about? Sorry, can you say the name again?
Timbal, Timbal. I'll put it in the chat.
And when's that coming back to market?
Probably April or May. It'll take a while. I mean, we're going to land it late this month, but it'll take it a while to get it across the country and get it sorted out and set up.
Yeah. So there was an extra dry vermouth we carried at Farmstead and was carried all across the country called Miro, and it was
correct. Did we lose you, Jeff?
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you kept talking. Yeah. So those gentler Catalan styles of vermouth are a lot of fun in whiskey drinks, especially again that sort of before dinner or afternoon whiskey cocktail. This next to last bullet is really important. If you're, Manhattan is a cold drink made with a tannic base spirit, the whiskey. And so really, when you buy a new bottle of whiskey, I highly recommend that you think you might want to make a cocktail with. I highly recommend you drink a little bit of it on the rocks. And if you feel a lot of tannin, a lot of kind of puckery character, will mostly be on the middle or front of your tongue, then don't be afraid that when you make a Manhattan with it to add that little bit of extra water. When you stir with ice, you can only get to so much dilution, but don't be afraid to add that little bit of extra water. It'll actually open up a lot more flavors because it'll keep you from focusing on the tannin. Think about temperature, same thing. Sometimes if I've got a whiskey that's particularly tannic, I'll just mix it with cold vermouth and cold water rather than getting it ice cold. That way, again, the tannins won't clamp down on my tongue as much. It's a lot of things to think about, but this is a pretty thinky group. And I think that, while when we go and drink cocktails in bars, there's a expectation of drinks being made in one specific way. It doesn't have to be that way when you're making it at home. You can really play around with dilution and temperature much more than a bartender who's expected to put ice in a mixing glass, stir it and strain it, and the drink be done and somehow perfect. So I hope by the tasting today and the chance maybe to dribble a few whiskeys into each of the vermouths, you'll get a sense of where I'm at, and maybe you may not get to the point of vermouth or Manhattan asceticism that I sometimes have, but yeah.
Well,
So-
I can't really speak for anyone else but myself, but I found this to be really, really informative. Every time we speak, Jake, I learn a ton, and I want to thank you again. It looks like there's a couple of other questions on the chat line, if you could answer them, but I want to
Sure.
thank you. If everyone else could unmute so we could applaud Jake and he could hear it. Thank you so much for your time.
This is for Joe Mader, the
Thank you.
the thing here. Michael asked about something called partner vermouth. I'm not familiar with that vermouth. So,
Jake, this is Rob.
yeah,
We didn't really talk about Kinato. Is that in a future class, or is that can you touch on that? Because at least in the US, Kinato is considered vermouth category from a FDA.
and it shouldn't be.
Right.
That's the simple answer for that.
Okay, so then
we'll talk about
we can punt that
bittered.
next time.
Yeah, we'll talk about quinine bittered wines in a future show. I'm gonna reshare here and just very quickly take you through our website. I know so many of you have been to it. This is the front page of our website. There's a lot of different ways you can get to our product information. The front page, you have articles, and then we have a random cocktail that we always put on the front page, which is a lot of fun. Our portfolio is broken down to wines and spirits. So spirits and gins and fruit brandy and things like that. Wines include both aromatized wines as well as what we call our sodalone selections, which are some deliberately oxidized wines, oxidized or oxidative wines from around the world that perhaps we'll talk about in a future session. But you can go by category. In fact, Joe, if this page, which is the top aromatized wine page, has another take on vermouth, Americano, and Quinquina.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Oh, I'm not muted. Sorry.
Then you can go. Then you can go by producer, and so I said to go through Cocchi. So here's the page for Cocchi. You'll have information on the producer, and then products they make. Cocchi also makes sparkling wine. We only sell it in a few states. We don't get a lot. The pick of the bunch is definitely the Bricchetto, but we always put it on here because just to, if nothing else, it shows that these guys really do know something about wine. But yeah, there you see Cocchi Americano Bianco, also Cocchi Americano Rosa, the two Americani, which we'll definitely talk about next time. They make a wonderful Barolo Canato. The legend is them and Baldo Capilano were the first two people to commercialize Barolo Canato. Very different styles. The Capilano is more medicinal, really intense herbaceousness, which I really love, but it takes a village to love it.
It's great.
The Cocchi Barolo Canato is much richer and rounder and spicier and sort of easier to have with dessert. Very different. And then the two vermouths they make, the Vermouth di Torino and the Vermouth Amaro. If you click on, let's say, Vermouth di Torino, you'll go to a product page. Those of you who are in the trade or need talking points for your friends who don't know anything about vermouth, there's a few talking points or bullets there, information about the product and the producer and the category. And then down here, a few recipes. There's 5 recipes on this page. Basically, the product pages are designed to be printed out to a one-pager. But then one of the ways into our recipe database is to click right here, and then you'll get pulled from our recipe database all the recipes that include Vermouth di Torino. That said, our favorite way to get into the recipe database is to go right here, click on recipes, and you'll get our full recipe database. 535 recipes in here. There's a bunch of different ways to filter it. If you're trying to get stuff that only includes low alcohol things, you could filter by a wine and beer license, which will get you 82 cocktails that don't require any trips to the Virginia ABC store, for those of you who live in the Commonwealth like I do. You can filter by product. So say for Comoz, there's 12 drinks that call for Comoz. You can filter by style or base or modifier or all kinds of things, or you can just look at the pretty pictures. Yeah. So a lot of good stuff here. I haven't stolen any from the Facebook group yet, but it's not to say that I wouldn't maybe ask to put a few on there. And then if you want to see just a PDF of everything that we import, we always have a link to our catalog on the front page. So this is our Fancy Pants catalog.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And with that, I'm gonna take down the share. And
yeah,
if there are any other questions, any other pertinent questions, I'll take them now. If not, I'll stop the recording and then we can just hang out.
Yeah. And Jake and I will be talking over the next week or two and come up with plans for webinar number 2. Tell your friends, you know, if you found this interesting, you don't have to be a member of Cocktail of the Day to join. And again, thanks everybody for attending. This was really, really fun.
Sure.